I'm excited to talk about your book because I think the concept of as a leftist, when I hear compromise, it makes my blood boil, right? But in many ways, Biden really ran and won as a compromise candidate, right? I am the unity candidate. I am against divisiveness and I'll bring people together, which really means I will compromise with the Republicans who are vile and I will give them part of what they want. And to that makes me want to vomit everywhere. But there is a literacy in this country where people find that appealing, or I guess a muscle memory, I should say. So why is that message so potent to many Americans?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, one of the answers I give in my book is that compromise has become something more than a practice that we engage in. It's become a sort of ethos or a moral attitude that we have come to sort of appreciate without thinking very hard about what compromise actually entails. So early in the book, I make a distinction between compromise as a means and compromise as an end. And when I talk about compromise as a means, what I mean is what most of us do every day in our workplaces and homes, where we engage in conflict and have to really work out hard with other people how we can get along despite our disagreements. And when we make those compromises, we usually don't enjoy them. They usually entail a certain amount of loss, a certain amount of anger, maybe some resentment, maybe some hopes that things will get better or that we'll get our own way eventually. And I contrast that notion of compromise as a means with what I think you're talking about and what I think Biden ran on, which is the compromise as an end. The idea that compromise is a good into itself, something we should aspire to, something we should want, and that people who are good compromisers are both morally and politically preferable to those who aren't.
Right. And something you brought up in your book, which I never thought about this way and was just so well said on the individual level, which you mentioned, compromise can seem like a way to inure regular people to the harshest consequences of capitalism as well. Talk a little bit about that concept.
Sure. So, I mean, capitalism demands compromise in a really brutal way on a number of levels. It turns those of us who don't agree with exploitation into exploiters, kind of by necessity, as we buy products that are made through process of exploitation and as we are ourselves exploited as workers. And it makes the compromises that we have to make in order to share resources harder because it drives scarcity by concentrating resources at the top and making the rest of us scramble for what is left. So compromise and capitalism to me are very much tangled up. And I think as a result, valuing compromise ends up turning around and often encouraging us to sort of implicitly accept the conditions that capitalism has given us when we really should be fighting against them.
And is that that seems to be by design. It allows people to, we've been talking a lot about the GOP's push for critical race theory and how that allows, it's basically designed to not just make our children not question our systems, but make them idealize them. And if you're also conditioning people to be good compromisers in relation to power structures, that seems to have a similar effect of protecting a class of people.
I think that's right. And I think sometimes it's by design and sometimes it's sort of a matter of just accepting things as they are and not pushing back very hard. So, I mean, for me, the particular way that compromise is functioning in our current moment politically on the left starts with the Clinton administration in the 1990s and the sort of acceptance of neoliberalization that we saw under that administration. So it was with the turn to Clinton era Democratic politics here, I mean, and this was tracking, of course, abroad in the Tony Blair administration and elsewhere, we start to see the left give up on sort of socialist valences of thinking about redistributing wealth, of critiquing capitalism in any meaningful way. And it's exactly at that point where we start to see the language of centrism, of third ways, and of compromise really take hold in the Democratic Party.
Right. I mean, including a think tank called Third Way.
Yes.
They should have just called it compromise or something like that. But I mean, like that is another thing that you wrote about that I thought was really just well said. The how compromise became an inherent or is an inherent value in liberalism, which I guess you can kind of more broadly talk about it as a value. Or not more broadly, but you can point to it as a value of neoliberalism, certainly as well. What did you mean by that?
By liberalism, or
by how compromise was inherent to liberalism?
Yeah, I mean, liberalism, of course, has so many definitions, like the sort of fuzzy target. And one of the reasons why I'm interested in taking on sort of liberalism as a whole in a book about compromise is that when one tries to sort of combat liberalism as a logic, one immediately seems like a nasty extremist who's likely to be in bed with all sorts of people one doesn't want to be in bed with. Because liberalism entails not only values of freedom and liberty, of course, but also values of moderation, rational discourse, things that most of us would like to believe in. So I think I take on liberalism in two different ways in the book. On one hand, I take on compromise as a central liberal value, because it is something we're taught to do as good liberal subjects when we engage in negotiations, is to compromise. But also in saying that I think there's a role for forms of discourse that are not compromising, I'm bringing in an opportunity to take on values like liberalism that I think require a sort of more strident approach.
And how do you draw a distinction between, say, liberalism and your perception of progressivism or leftism? Because I think our power structures would say that's orthodoxy, as opposed to morality.
Yeah. So my definition of liberalism as opposed to sort of the politics I'm embracing, I suppose, for me, since my background is in art and literature, I sort of start, maybe counterintuitively, especially for your audience, which are probably mostly people more politically savvy than I am, but I start looking at the arts and the distinction between works of art that take these very strong stands, avant-gardist and experimental works that really try to challenge people, as opposed to works of art that sort of play to the market, that play to your average reader, that sort of aim themselves at larger audiences. And I think I see something analogous in political sensibilities. So yes, we have these really clear, I think, partisan divides within the left, even between, say, the Bernie Sanders social democracy contingent and the sort of more centrist Biden contingent, for instance. But I think that those are policy differences, and I feel very strongly on the left of that spectrum myself in terms of my own politics. But there are also, I think, attitudinal differences between those two positions. And those are where I think seeing the analogous relationship to art is very instructive, in the sense that I think there's as much, in some ways, a sort of aesthetic difference between certain forms of leftism and others as there is a policy difference. And you hear the sort of attitude policing all the time from the center toward the left. It's not so much that they say, like, you shouldn't have a $15 minimum wage. It's sort of, it's much more commonly, well, you're not being patient, you're not waiting for incrementalism to do its work, you're asking too much, you're being too loud. And it's those kind of aesthetic properties of the political disagreement that I think are really revealed by looking at these things in relation to similar trends in works of art.